Welcome back. Lecture 38. This is Minimalism and then Other Trends in Sculpture, mid-century, 20th century. The main topic for this section is minimalism, and as the name suggests, the style is really all about making things with the fewest number of marks, fewest number of colors, fewest number of tools. You could almost think of minimalism as a reaction against the kind of excessive exuberance of abstract expressionism. But there's another way to think of it as well. We talked a little about Clement Greenberg in the previous lecture as a supporter of Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism in general. And his enthusiasm for what they were doing did change over time. And Greenberg eventually wrote an essay about trends in painting that he thought should happen next. He referred to the movement of minimalism as being post-painterly abstraction. He really believed that art was only good when it was advancing the new. And so here was Pollock doing something brand new, getting rid of subject and making painting all about formal issues of line, texture, color, and movement. But then he had also noted that each of the artists in that abstract expressionist movement were making things that were their own individual styles. They were still inputting their own personality, their own particular way of making marks, from dripping to staining to brushwork to color field. And what Clement Greenberg really saw happening was that they had created a new cult of, here's my way of doing it, now people should start imitating it. So he really advocated for this advancement in art so that instead of keeping things the same, instead of becoming an abstract expressionist and staying one the rest of your life, he wondered what art could do next. And so minimalism appealed to him because these artists were faced with the fact that Pollock and his generation had become really world famous. The art world had shifted from Paris and London to New York. And so now what are you going to do? Do you just keep regurgitating what they're doing, or do you take some new direction? So the minimalists thought, all right, you took subject matter out, but you left all this sloppy humanness in it. What if we take all that sloppiness away? What if we clean everything up and make it almost look as if the person isn't involved? Take a look at abstract Sculpture by David Smith. The pieces at the bottom are essentially the ones to know for the test. That's series 3 of the sculptures in his series known as the Hubie series. They are arrangements of geometrical solids in space, primarily rectangular solids, but there's a few shapes that have slight curvature, and there are some squares. They're not meant to represent any specific thing. They're not meant to reference the human body. Here's a piece in the North Carolina Museum by Joel Shapiro, same idea. They're not even done in such a way that you see the hand of the artist making it. They almost look like they were made by machines. And in fact, some of the artists who worked in the minimalist style would simply create the diagrams and designs and have machine shops cut and weld the pieces to make them as precise and clean as they could possibly be. So you can imagine that for artists who were interested in subject matter and storytelling, that this kind of style was really not something that they were interested in doing. In blue text on the screen, I just want to call your attention to some art terms there. We talk a lot in the abstract expressionist movement and in minimalism about the use of the visual elements. Now, we can think of those as the artist's tools. Line, shape and its three-dimensional equivalent mass, color and value, light and dark, texture and space. And then we also have the principles of design. Is the image balanced? Is it harmonious? Does it have variety? Is there a repeated pattern or motif? Is there rhythm or movement? What's the scale and proportion? These are ways that we relate to or organize the visual elements. And for the minimalists, they're picking one or two of those ideas, shape and color, for instance, and focusing solely on those. Here's a minimalist piece from the the 20th century, again at the North Carolina Museum of Art. This is the work of Robert Bladen. The work that you're seeing here is one of the most notorious of this movement toward minimalism. This is the work of Richard Serra. Now, Richard Serra was an art world sensation. He was definitely getting a lot of attention. Some pieces that he had made in which he tried to do in steel, or in metal rather, what the abstract expressionists were known for doing. He was playing with what the material itself could do. So he'd made sculptures by, instead of creating a mold and pouring molten metal into it, simply throwing molten metal into sand and letting it take the shape that it took. Now by this point in his career, he had started making sculpture out of large sheets of steel. Very often they were curved, sometimes very intricately curved, and often they would be leaning at a precarious angle, which would make you feel a little tense, as if the thing might fall down. In multiple exhibitions and in cover stories of art magazines, people in the art world knew who he was and respected what he was doing. There was a program, which still exists, for the federal government. Whenever a federally funded building is built, a percentage of the budget is meant to go toward public art. It's called the Percent for Art program. In this case, half of 1% of the cost of the building, which in this case would be $175,000. Now that sounds like a lot of money to pay for a simple, slightly curved, slightly leaning wall of steel, but the committee that chose Richard Serra as the artist to create the piece for this federal building in New York were comprised of art world officials, people who worked in museums, people who had a connection to the arts in general, people who knew what the trends in art were, and they really advocated for made a case for art that would be progressive, art that would push boundaries and do new things. So when this piece was installed, you can imagine that some people thought, wow, this is the cutting edge, it's the avant-garde, it's so awesome, and other people thought it was absolutely ridiculous. If you see the work from above, you get a sense of scale when you see it this way, but look at it from above, you can see that it completely blocks that plaza. If you were in that office building and you wanted to go buy a hot dog from a street vendor and sit and eat your lunch at the fountain, you'd have to encounter this big wall, which also runs opposite all of the curves that you see in the tiling on the plaza itself. So the piece is meant to kind of frustrate you, to get in your way, challenge the space, and make you have to deal with it. Now, you may think ridiculous idea, but that's partially, I think, what Richard Serra was going for, was challenging your use of a public space, making you think about it in a different way than you might otherwise think about it. There was a survey or a petition that went around to get the piece removed, and that was countered by people trying to advocate for keeping it. And believe it or not, it was about a 50-50 split of opinion about whether the piece was progressive, modern, new, and exciting, or whether it was a big, stupid, ugly thing that needed to go. One of the arguments that was used against it was that it was going to attract graffiti, which, like, what surface in New York City doesn't attract graffiti, but okay. Another argument was that a terrorist would hide a bomb near it. Like, I guess you would only not see it if you were on the opposite side of the wall, but okay. It's a little bit of an odd argument there. So there was so much outcry about it, both pro and con, that the government decided to remove it at night on a weekend to avoid protest. And one of the points they tried to make was, well, couldn't we just relocate it, put it somewhere else? And what Richard Serra had to say about it was that to put it in any other place would deactivate its function of interrupting that space. He referred to it as a site-specific, S-I-T-E, specific sculpture, that it was meant for that space. Love it or hate it, it certainly made people have to use that space in a different way. If it was out in the middle of a field somewhere, it would have a very different effect. Other pieces by Serra, though, give you an idea of why it chose him for this project. So maybe it just wasn't as interesting a piece as some of these others. You can imagine how unnerving it might be to walk through a gallery space or museum space with these kinds of walls that you'd be able to walk in between and around. It's kind of an interesting subject there. This is my personal favorite of his pieces, and you can see that this one is safe for viewers in some respects because it is inside of a walled outdoor space. You would have to pay admission to the gallery to get into this courtyard. So even though there are places where someone could theoretically hide, the chance of that happening in a public space outdoors with no fence or no wall around it, much different from what you get here. But you do get a sense of what it would be like to inhabit one of his sculptural spaces. Donald Judd is a great example for us of what minimalist sculpture can be. They look like they were fabricated by machines and placed in position by bots. They really are elegant, beautiful surfaces, interesting colors, but they're kind of cold, right? So this appeals to some people's aesthetic. It appeals to some people not at all. Much like the other styles we've studied, you either will like it or not. This is my personal love-hate piece. I think it's great in terms of meeting the goals of minimalism. I think it's really irritating on another level. This piece is called 144 Zinc Square by Carl Andre. It is 12 by 12 inch tiles of zinc laid side by side to form a square. It's barely three-dimensional. To me, sculpture really should be three-dimensional. This one is just barely dimensional in height. It certainly occupies space along the floor. He made multiple variations of this idea. There's an aluminum square. There's other materials that he used for this kind of idea. It does change the space, but it does so in a very, very minimal kind of way. This is the work of Sol LeWitt, who took the idea of minimalist shapes and iteration through math to kind of add a little bit of a scientific edge to what he was doing. Artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. It's kind of a fascinating thing to say for someone who made a cube expand multiple times over to create this visual sculptural experience. My personal favorite Sol LeWitt work, though, are the wall drawings. And this is kind of a frustrating one for people because he would create these on the walls of galleries or museums if he was asked to do a show in a museum. They would be painted directly to the walls of that space, and when the show was over, they would just repaint the wall back to their original base color and hang the next exhibition. So the work didn't really exist physically at all. The interesting thing about them, though, is that they were for sale. So how do you buy a wall in a building? You can't hammer the wall out and carry it home with you. If you purchased one of the pieces, what you would get would be a copyrighted, essentially, recipe or set of instructions for how to build that piece, how to recreate it. So all of his wall pieces are currently on exhibition, having all been recreated according to his original plans. Kind of a fascinating idea. These are some of the wall pieces as well. The bottom gives you a sense of what the instructions would be like. The 8th point is located halfway between the 2 points where the arc with the center at the first point, yada yada. But if you follow that recipe, you'd be able to recreate exactly the image from that particular piece, which was wall drawing number 305. Barnett Newman takes some of his inspiration partially from what Rothko was doing with color field and makes it even more simplistic. His brushstroke is almost completely invisible. It looks like a pigmented surface that wasn't painted by hand, even though it was painted by hand. And he inserts these vertical elements, very thin lines, which he referred to specifically by the term zips. If you think of it as a zipper or you think of it as something that moves in space, the longer you stand in front of one of these, some of those zips seem closer to you and others seem further away. It does invite you to investigate it for a little bit of length of time. It kind of places you in a slightly alternate reality. It plays tricks with your perception of space. And oddly, I think he would have enjoyed that idea of using something so abstract to create human interaction. Other artists are following on this color field idea and pushing the minimalist agenda in new directions. Ad Reinhardt is one of the first artists in America, anyway, extremely close value changes between just two slight variations of the same color in these all black paintings, or here you can see the slight change of a slightly brighter versus slightly duller blue that sort of make plus signs in those three panels. His exhibition in the early 60s really sparked interest in minimalism. So if you can imagine that by the mid to late 50s, the abstract expressionists are now the establishment. They're the art of the art world has decided are the best. The up-and-coming younger artists are looking for new and different ways to do things. So Ad Reinhardt's work really kind of helped them shape things like this. Now, as a kid, I loved this. It's kind of odd to me now because it's so bright, it's almost hard to look at. But children very often are attracted to really bright, extreme colors. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings all have very clean edges and intense colors. That's really what he was known for, and this painting is a good example from 1963. Kenneth Noland, believe it or not, is a North Carolina painter, born in Asheville and studied at Black Mountain College. His work very often references repeated lines or fairly simple shapes like this chevron or triangle shape, or this one, which is reminiscent to a lot of us as lined paper for learning how to write in cursive. There are bunches of paintings in this kind of style that almost look like they were made purely by machine. Frank Stella is an artist to know in this minimalist kind of field. Paintings are sometimes inspired by real things, and such is the case here with the Die Fahne hoch painting. The flag high is the translation, which was made in response to a Nazi propaganda film that he'd seen, which had that same title. So his work very often is two-tone, at least the stuff that made him really famous at the beginning of his career. And you can see that what he does here is really break with convention and make painting almost be a hybrid with sculpture. These were the pieces that really made his career. The paintings that you're seeing there are on what we call shaped canvases. They're not rectangles or squares anymore. Now they're octagons, polygons, pentagons, and they actually are pierced all the way through. What you're seeing, you can really see it here with the pentagonal shape, but you can see there that shadow. That is the wall in the center of the gallery. That's the wall in the center. That stripe there is the shadow the painting is casting on the wall. So shaped canvas is really what he's best known for. The piece that you see here, Nunca Pasa Nada from 1964, the white at the top and the bottom is the white of the gallery wall. So you can definitely get a feeling that this would work well in a corporate environment. This might look great in an office or in a kind of industrial setting, maybe not so much in your own home. Robert Mangold is an artist who definitely explored the limits of what minimalism could do. These very much look like they could be made by machine. But he also is an artist who changed his mind about the limitations, I think, of the minimalist movement. These are pieces from 60s and 70s. 1970, Bryce Martin. Check this out by hand about 1980s. Again, I don't think any artist is solely trapped in one particular idea. A lot of the artists, like Martin in particular, to a degree, Mangold as well, were artists who started off working with an abstract idea and then began to want to explore other alternatives. And you could argue that Martin's early work is minimalist and the later work almost is a new form of abstract expressionism for the 80s. Now, not to suggest that this is an artist who's classified properly as a minimalist, but to look at some trends in modern sculpture from mid-century toward the end of the 20th century, we have to look at the work of Isamu Noguchi. You can look at examples of Noguchi's work online. There's a great edition of his work in paper, making large-scale, and I truly mean large-scale, lanterns with paper and wood. Noguchi was a really influential Japanese-American sculptor. He willingly went into an American internment camp for Japanese Americans, documented that experience, which is a pretty radical thing to do. But his sculpture, for the most part, is not representational. It does use sometimes geometric forms, more often forms that are geometric and then softened, as in Black Sun at the top right. But he also tried to break down the barrier between sculpture and everyday life in designs like the table that you see at the bottom left. You've probably seen an image of that type of table in set design in movies and in TV shows. It's a very, very famously reproduced object that shares some of the shapes of the design of the table with some of the designs that he did in sculpture, particularly in wood. Here are some examples of the paper lanterns I was talking about, and these can range in size from things that would sit on tables to things that are so large they're big enough to almost walk inside of. He also designs for stage sets and for kids' playgrounds. Again, not that she's technically really a minimalist, but someone doing new concepts in sculpture is Louise Nevelson. You could argue minimalism in terms of minimal color and also rejection for the most part of subject matter. You wouldn't know to look at it, but the images on this screen are all meant to be part of one single sculpture. You kind of get a feeling of that at the bottom in the center. These are sculptures made of found objects. Technique is assemblage, things that are assembled, put together, glued, hammered, screwed, welded, attached in whatever way. Nevelson was known for attachments of primarily wood, but she also worked in metal. She would kind of dumpster dive or scavenge bits of wood from buildings that were being renovated or torn down and store them in her studios and then combine them into these objects. She's created for us in this example a true installation, a sculpture that occupies a three-dimensional space, is comprised of multiple pieces that you have to walk into and around and through in order to experience. And it's actually meant to represent a wedding. So believe it or not, these two pieces are meant to represent bride and groom. This section here is meant to evoke the entrance to a chapel where they're going for their wedding, which you wouldn't get, I don't think, without the titles. But when you see that they're made from everyday objects, it's really kind of pushing sculpture into a new and different form. It's unifying. There's the chapel section by itself. She unifies these multiple different pieces by the use of that single color, which is about the only way that you could barely put her into the minimalist category. I wanted these last sculptors to be included here sort of in response to minimalism, alternate ways of approaching new forms of sculpture. Nevelson's piece to know for the test is Tropical Garden, again comprised primarily of wood and unified in this case by painting the entire surface black. Most of her best known pieces are either all white or all black. Hard at first perhaps to see this as a garden because so many of the forms are somewhat recognizable as pieces of furniture or objects from staircases, hand railings, banisters, so forth. But if you look especially here and kind of imagine leaves and water flowing over them in a tropical rainforest, you kind of get a feeling of verticality and movement and the organic nature and culture of leaves in a tropical environment. Eva Hesse could be theoretically kind of put in the minimalist category because of use of minimal materials, but really we should think again as a response to what the minimalists had done, which was to kind of break sculpture away from having to be representational, but now to push into exploration of new materials. Eva Hesse unfortunately passed away really young from complications from a brain tumor at the age of 34, but she had become already known for some similar techniques to what Richard Serra was doing in what became known as process art, the idea of letting the material show you what its limitations are, like throwing molten metal into sand to create a form. She's doing this in this case with fiberglass. These are pieces that are very much a hybrid of fabric, wax, fiberglass that begin to explore repetition of similar forms, but with some individuality thrown in they make kind of interesting avatars almost for human beings, for the idea of skin or bodies that were all very, very similar and yet at the same time extraordinarily different one from the other. The last artist to look at here in this section, again, you could kind of say minimalist because of simple shapes and colors, is Martin Puryear. And Martin Puryear has become more and more well known over time. He's one of America's most successful sculptors at the moment. He's an African-American artist whose work very much reflects his experience as an African-American, but in a highly abstracted way. A lot of the pieces are representative of him as self-portraits. They're really kind of remarkable forms to see in space. They're quite elegant, quite simple oftentimes, and they invite repeated viewing and introspection.